community-owned development is key to ensuring climate justice and economic transformation. Welcome. My name is Alice Mohwe. On behalf of the International Federation for Human Rights, FIDH, I'm honored to be here at FIX as moderator of this event. I'm also thrilled to be together with this group of panelists of dynamic change makers and thought leaders. Today, we gather at a critical moment, at the confluence of interconnected crises, including those of debt, of threats to multilateralism, the climate emergency, and the shrunken civil society space. Let us not forget that these stem from systemic inequalities and inequities, as well as an unsustainable development model, all disproportionately affecting, in particular, the most marginalized of communities. As we face the dual struggles of accelerating climate change and the urgent need for sustainable, inclusive economic growth, it is clear that top-down solutions do not work for positive development outcomes. We have to work harder to ensure that development projects deliver actual development, are effective, and serve people over profit, given the many challenges faced in the development sector, including devastating cuts to development aid. This in the context, for example, of the United States of America possibly removing its funding share to the International Partners Group, which supports South Africa's Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, to support its transition from fossil fuels to cleaner energy sources to ensure a just and equitable process for affected communities. Only yesterday, the UK government announced that 2.5% of their GDP is to be allocated to military spending, and that's approximately 17 billion per annum, and cutting a foreign aid budget by 40% from 2027. As has been discussed on several occasions, the impacts of climate change hit hardest where vulnerability is greatest, making it essential to put communities at the heart of our development strategies. To achieve a just energy transition, climate justice, and economic transformation, we must rethink our approaches, ensuring that international finance and development policies genuinely reflect and realistically address the needs and aspirations of local communities, the people. I am excited to be a part of our conversation about some of the critical factors which are shaping our shared future. Today, we shall explore how locally led development initiatives empower communities to take charge of their own progress, ensuring that decisions are made by those who understand local challenges best. As we're guided by the imperative of just energy transition, we also have to discuss the path towards an economic transformation which prioritizes resilience and inclusion of local economies while upholding human rights. On this journey, public development banks play a crucial role. By engaging with civil society, they can better integrate communities to ensure more sustainable impact. This dialogue, enriched by a variety of perspectives, promises to demonstrate that realizable possibility, basically how people-centered approaches can drive systemic change. In other words, what good action can look like. I'd now like to turn to the distinguished panelists, whom I'm delighted to introduce, and they will guide us through this conversation. We've arranged this afternoon's panel in 3 parts. The first part is contextualizing key issues, and the 2 panelists who will be speaking will be providing us with concrete examples to make real our panel topic. The first speaker, Fama Sarr, who's president of the Women Fishers Association from Senegal, will be speaking. And after Fama, Joseph Maniragena from the Slum Dwellers International will be speaking. Fama will be speaking in French for those who need to get your hearing apparatus out. Over to you, Fama. If I'd also appeal to my panelists, there are 9 of you. Could you please stick to maximum 5 minutes so that we have enough space for the rest of the panel to speak. Thank you. Over to you, Madame Fama.
Good evening, everyone. to internalize this debate, I want to talk about fossil energy in Senegal. Despite all the world commitment trying to limit the climate change in line with the Paris Agreement, so despite all that, Senegal is a country that is independent in terms of electricity, and we want to use gas and oil. The GTA project and another project that Senegal is sharing with Mauritania, that is being held by BP, and it's a big project in the West. And in our communities, we go and explain to them right there at the grassroots, meaning that all the means and how they can sustain their livelihood. You hear me? You heard probably about Gatara. It was a place that was a reserve for fishermen in that community, and in that zone, BP and others, they put the gas plants in that area, and that entails women vulnerability, and women are the most threatened. Despite all the exploitation, they deprive them from fishing and other products, and the lack of lack of environmental protection, and also the fact that they took our fishing environment. It really affected the social livelihood of the population. So we know that it's by the Paris Agreement that Senegal signed an amount of 2.5 billion and in that partnership, we had a group of international partners, and the Senegal considered that Senegal is a source of transitional energy for Senegal. And as a community that was impacted, I do not share that vision, and I know you're going to ask me why. Today, the investment plan of BP was signed by the African Bank of Development, and the first intervention in Senegal, when we talk about Shaltra and Sendou call, all these are lobbied by some people, and now they want to finalize that project. But I want to tell you that without the involvement of the grassroots community, nothing will happen. Today, when they are talking about these grassroots community that are impacted and the energy transition, and we know that even within the regions, there are some localities that are lacking energy or electricity. We will try to acknowledge, to support the leadership of local women, and in this transition, we want to ask them. We want to tell them that we need energetic transition that is fair, and we want to tell them that, want it or not, public development banks, which are always favorable to fossil energy, we are not ready for this energetic transition. We want a transition that is fair, because the voice of the affected communities should be taken into account. We will also tell them to guarantee transparency and responsibility in the management of GP. In any other kind of transition, we are not going to talk without without also addressing the African Bank of Development to trying to come back to its partnership, and also to see how they will involve the communities that are impacted today. Thousands of young people who are already about to lose their jobs because of oil in the area. We also want to talk to Bebe Cosmos to respect its commitments. Today we are talking about environment pollution, and due to the use of metal and other things. So please allow me to tell you what you want. We need to redirect the finances to the centralized and fair transition that will favor the local community. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup, Madame. I now call upon Joseph Manirangela, Slum Dwellers International. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Program Director. And thank you so much for this time to give what we think from the slum dwellers perspective. I'm actually looking at the poster there. That photo is for my boss. It's not mine. That is Joseph Muturi, who is the chair of Slum Dwellers International, and he is based in Kenya. But coming to why we are here, let me first thank really all and everyone who have taken their time to come and participate. I saw old colleagues whom we have worked a long time ago. It's so good to see everyone here. Honored guests, policymakers, public development banks, civil society, and fellow community advocates. It's really an honor for me to stand here representing Slum Dwellers International, and on behalf of my director, Dr. Beth, who couldn't make it. SDI is a network that works directly with grassroots communities, mainly living in the informal settlement across more than 23 countries. At SDI, we empower communities in informal settlement to drive inclusive urban development, advocate for secure tenure, and access essential services like housing, water, and sanitation. Our strength lies in community-driven data collection, saving groups, and strong partnerships that amplify local voices in national and global and investment decisions. That's why we are really happy to be invited. We believe that communities must lead their own development, not just be passive beneficiaries of top-down intervention. What are the problems we would want to share which our community face? For those of us in the front line of climate crisis, the challenges are urgent, structural, and deeply unjust. Despite contributing to the least to climate change, informal settlement residents, by now nearly 1 billion people worldwide, they face the harshest impact. They face unbearable heat in their poorly built homes that lack cooling or proper infrastructure. They have a flood on a regular basis that wash away their livelihoods, they wash away their homes, and anytime they are expected that anytime the disaster can arrive. Rising food and energy costs that force families to choose between survival and dignity, displacement, and the eviction risk as governments see informal settlement as a problem to remove rather than community to support. Yet, when climate finance is discussed, when policies are made, and when investments are designed, local communities, and in particular slum dwellers, they are rarely at the table. Instead, funding is channeled through government and the large institutions with complex top-down framework that often fail to reach the people who need it most. Decisions are made far from the realities of the communities they are meant to serve. Why do we think community-led development is key? If we are really serious about climate justice and economic transformation, we must shift the balance of power toward locally led development. By this I mean direct and accessible climate finance for communities. Let climate funds flow directly to locally led organizations, and then we're all gaining because we are cutting out unnecessary bureaucratic barriers. Let's have flexible, long-term funding, which should replace the short-term, project-based grants that do not address systemic challenges. We also want to suggest that the community who are experts and they are leaders in their own right should be recognized. One of the greatest injustices in the work of development, in the work of climate finance, is that the real expert, the people who are experiencing climate change every day, they are often ignored in decision-making. At SDI, we know that data is power, and our federation members, women and youth, have been leading this data collection. In concluding, we really don't need development for communities. What we need is development by communities. Public development banks, policymakers, and funders, we should move beyond consultation to real power sharing. Climate finance should reach local community, community-led data, and knowledge-shaped policy investment. The world cannot solve climate change or achieve sustainable economic transformation while we leave behind the very poor who bear its greatest burden. It's time we shift the balance. Let's build the future and let's leave no one behind. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. So having contextualized the key issues through the lived experiences of communities, we now move on to what can be done about them, and whether, and if so, how we can avoid a repetition of these kinds of lived experiences. So we're going to be looking at proposing solutions, ideas for a way forward. We have 4 speakers. Christelle Kalule, who's chair of the board of Forest, and she'll speak on human rights and meaningful social stakeholder engagement. After Christelle, and she will speak in French. The second speaker will be Roby Halip, who's coordinator of the Right Energy Partnership with Indigenous Peoples in Philippines. And Roby will speak about how good looks like. The third speaker will be Sandra Martinson, Policy and Advocacy Manager, Sustainable Economic Development, Bond, and she will speak on locally led DFIs. And then the last speaker under this section will be Ulrich Volz, who's Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for Sustainable Finance at SOAS University, and he'll be speaking on centering PDBs in the development finance ecosystem. So I'd like to call upon Christelle, 5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Fama and Joseph, for sharing with us the challenges which the communities are facing. It is a real pleasure and privilege for me to be in Cape Town. As an African, this is very moving and motivating to be in such a glorious city. I'm really eager to share with you exclusively the findings of the study, the mechanism of civil society for development. We wanted to explore engagement mechanisms of public development banks with civil society. We compare these banks, World Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, as well as South American Development Bank. The Asian Bank, as well as the New Development Bank led by BRICS. This is a real strategic tool in order to help reshape financial institutions and their engagement, reshape their commitment towards civil society, including with local communities. And the study highlights major challenges such as the lack of consultation with local communities, and there's a lot of complaints about this, and it shows that consultations are not adequate. Due diligence is lacking about the negative social impacts, and those gaps have negative impacts on community life. This study has for objective to reduce the gap between theory and practice by giving concrete recommendations, such as diversifying and making the consultation way more inclusive by including digital formats and processes that are accessible to communities. Transparency needs to go beyond access to information. We know this is technical language and wording. It is very important to have a language that is simple, direct, understandable, available, as well as in local languages. I hope that interpretation is going through. I'm not sure that you all understand me. But we have some samples of the studies. We have a few available for you. And the findings show the importance of having solid guarantee mechanisms through the UN framework, as well as due diligence with human rights and a commitment on gender equality and the protection of vulnerable persons. PDBs need to have zero tolerance on consequences for whistleblowers, and communities need to be freely able to express themselves, and they need to have access to mechanisms efficient in order to solve their problems and to evaluate their actions. We would like more commitments for the PDBs for the taking into account of the needs of communities and their visions. And we can do this together. This is why I would like to invite you all to take part in the new initiatives. The coalition of civil society and banks in joint commitments for creating forums, regular forums where we can exchange best practices. We will be able to co-create sustainable solution, transforming solution, and prosperity for all. Thank you for your attention. And I would like to ask you, to invite you to come between 16:45 and 17:45 in financing the future, the commitment of local communities for sustainable solutions. Thank you. Thank you very much, Christelle.
Alip?
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm Roby Halip. I'm from the Kalanguya and Kankanai indigenous peoples in the northern part of the Philippines. You may be wondering what's a Filipina doing here in Southern Africa. So I'm with the Right Energy Partnership with Indigenous Peoples. It's an indigenous-led platform that works across regions, Asia, Africa, Latin America, Pacific, and in other areas where indigenous peoples are. Now, this initiative seeks to put in the forefront not only the challenges that indigenous peoples are facing in the just energy transition, but the initiatives that we also have to advance our own energy sovereignty. These initiatives are anchored in the principles of reciprocity, giving back to Mother Earth, and sustainability, ensuring that the next generations will have the same environment or a better environment that we have now. Now, despite the challenges in our territories brought about by top-down, profit-driven development, which is causing displacement, destruction of sacred sites, and loss of livelihood in our territories, we push forward to address the needs in our communities through our renewable energy initiatives. And these IP-led, indigenous-led initiatives integrates traditional knowledge with modern technology. Through our partner in Malaysia, Tunibong, who've been working into indigenous-led renewable energy initiatives for 2 decades now, they've been helping indigenous communities in off-grid areas to be able to have access to energy, but not only that, also strengthen traditional livelihood of indigenous peoples by integrating renewable energy technology. Now, part of the initiative that we have is also on recycling, to make sure recycling plastics and aluminum cans, to make sure that turbines that are being used for mini hydro dams are made more affordable for indigenous communities. Now, again, as I mentioned a while ago, the approach that we have is not only responding to access to energy, but a holistic approach of supporting indigenous communities, eventually to be able to strengthen their defense of their land rights and their resources. And this somehow shifts the power to communities to be able to also negotiate better with companies who would want to implement projects in their communities, as they already have strengthened their capacities and their livelihoods, and would not be baited with employment, roads, or electricity when projects comes in. We also work to strengthen interlearning and solidarity among indigenous peoples through interlearning exchanges and establishment of regional learning hubs. We're starting now with Asia to be able to, through Tonibong, our partner in Malaysia, to establish a regional learning hub for indigenous peoples on indigenous-led renewable energy initiatives. We do have some experience already here in Africa, but we need to consolidate what are the challenges, what are the needs and priorities to be able to effectively address our fellow indigenous brothers and sisters' needs in relation to advancing their energy sovereignty. Now, in line with this, we call for more support for community-led renewable energy initiatives and direct partnership with indigenous peoples, leveraging on our leadership and knowledge and anchored on the respect of our rights. That includes our collective rights that's enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We also call for direct financing for indigenous peoples anchored on trust and flexible enough for us to be able to implement our self-determined needs and priorities. For the public development banks and the private sector, we call for strengthened accountability mechanisms on human rights harms that's being committed in our communities. It's always been a challenge for many indigenous peoples and affected communities to access these mechanisms. And finally, extractivism and false climate solutions will not address the current climate crisis we are in. More support for people-led solutions is needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robbie. Sandra, 5 minutes.
Hello, everyone. I'll be brief and concise. What we have seen over the last 5 decades is the increased outsourcing of development policy and decision-making to external actors such as MDBs and DFIs, which is not sustainable and exacerbates dependency. If you're truly serious about climate justice, economic transformation, enabling all countries to take sustainable, resilient development pathway, we won't achieve that without local ownership and leadership of development agenda. Moreover, as MDBs and DFIs in particular are heavily relying on ODA, aid money, which is being cut by most Western countries as we speak, it has never been more important to localize development finance. Top-down, Eurocentric, and often extractivist approach to development needs to stay in the past. So what does the locally led development approach mean to DFIs and MDBs? There are many questions to be asked. To what extent priority challenges and solutions are agreed on through meaningful, inclusive engagement and dialogue, through consultation with local stakeholders, especially those who we aspire to support, women, smallholder farmers, youth, the poorest, whose knowledge and expertise is used to inform the decision-making? Are all investments decisions aligned with national development and industrial strategies, SDGs, nationally determined contribution plans, and so on? Do the boards and investment decision-making bodies include representatives of local stakeholders, civil society, experts of human rights, gender equality, sustainable food systems, social development? What governance mechanisms we have in place to deliver accountability not only to their shareholders, which in most cases are Western governments, but to those who PDBs are meant to serve? Who defines what development impact is and how success looks like? Are the produced goods and services through these investments primarily supporting the needs of the local communities and economies or Western consumers? Will the green copper in DRC support electrification of Africa or Europe? Who these investments are going to? International investor companies, businesses, or locally owned companies, which are critical for the local long-term socio-economic fabric. When majority of workforce across Africa are highly vulnerable informal sector, what impact and transformation PDBs can achieve by working only within formal sector? Imagine how DFIs and MDBs investment portfolios may look like if they were co-designed with local development actors and stakeholders, especially civil society, communities, human rights and social development actors. Reforms of global financial architecture, I believe, offer a timely opportunity to reimagine how international development finance works, what it truly is for, what we even understand by development, and how international PDBs should work, not in parallel, but in closely together with local actors to enable local ownership and leadership of their own development pathways. There are many things what can be done. PDB's investments must align with individual countries' development strategies, visions, climate actions, and SDGs targets. That's not necessarily the case right now. We need to reform decision-making processes. As previous speaker was saying, form a meaningful, systematic engagement of civil society, communities, and national stakeholders is absolutely critical. We need to reform also the key investment decision-making bodies which represent and include actors of countries where PDBs invest, ensuring diversity of expertise and perspectives are linked to the key development outcomes, like gender equality, sustainable food systems, green infrastructure, thriving local economies. PDBs must focus on the local economic ecosystem building, which means nurturing local entrepreneurial capacity and nascent sectors, building local regional supply chains to advance economic resilience and self-sufficiency, especially in the critical strategic sectors, prioritize local needs, local value addition, and the value chain approach, procuring locally and making technology transfers part of the investment process. We should prioritize focus on supporting local actors to ensure investments strengthen sustainable local economic development. We need to also work, especially the international DFIs and MDBs should work more closely together with local public development banks and other local strategic financial institutions, which are best placed to shape markets in alignment with countries' strategic priorities and vision, commitments around SDGs and climate action, that also create enabling environment and reach local SMEs by blending development needs with commercial viability. We also need to come up with instruments targeting informal economy, which holds the greatest potential of reducing poverty and inequality. To conclude, we need to also remember that productivity starts with investment in people, accessible quality, public health, education, and social protection. There is no shortcut to sustainable development without investing in people first and complementing the broader investments in infrastructure. Debt and dependency trap is in development. Development is more than just economic growth and jobs. It's about transformation and emancipation. Thank you.
Thank you. Ulrich, 5 minutes. I know you're a lecturer. It's going to be a real challenge.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to speak on this panel. And as the session title states, locally led and locally owned development is key to ensuring climate justice and economic transformation. And this also requires the mobilization of local finance. So that's what I want to focus on. Some of you will have heard me earlier today saying that strengthening domestic savings and domestic financial resource mobilization is absolutely critical in this context. So there is not a single economy, taking some petro-states away, that has successfully developed without raising domestic savings and creating a local financial sector that can create credit for productive investment. So without domestic financial resource mobilization, it will be absolutely impossible to address the big problem of high cost of capital, which everyone's talking about. So we need to be very clear about the limits to international development finance. It can only complement local finance, it cannot replace it. It's also very important to highlight time and again that dependency on international finance, which mostly is foreign currency finance, is actually perpetuating structural problems of underdevelopment, of high cost of capital, and creating macroeconomic and financial instabilities. So most development finance really ought to be in local currency because most SDGs, most climate action will not generate foreign currency returns, and then countries end up with debt problems. And we see that to a very extreme extent again in this moment. So we need to get real about the limits to mobilizing international private capital. And some will say, well, poor countries don't really, they're poor, they don't have capital, they can't really mobilize local savings and so on, but that's not true. Development is a process of structural transformation, and in this process you have to mobilize savings because otherwise they're not going to develop. And what we do see is that while the trillions of international private capital have not been flowing to developing countries, we have seen trillions of dollars flowing the other direction. So we published a report a couple of months ago where we showed that developing emerging countries, excluding China, built up net foreign assets to the tune of $16 trillion. And at least part of that could have been invested locally. And for example, in this part of the world, many pension funds invest a large majority of their assets abroad rather than in local development. So there are pools of formal savings that can be tapped for local development, but there are also large pools of informal savings that can be channeled into the financial system for productive investment. And the countries that have been successful in development, they did manage to mobilize local savings, and public financial institutions did, in almost all cases, play a critical role. In my home country, Germany, in the 18th century, the first public savings banks were created. They were critical in mobilizing local savings for local development. In the UK, in 1861, the postal savings system was set up to fund local development, fund industrialization. And the successful East Asian developing countries, they've all set up public financial institutions to really mobilize these savings. And so we do need to strengthen public development banks in developing emerging countries at the national but also subnational level. And multilateral development banks, international development finance institutions can play an important role in supporting them, in empowering them to play the larger role that is needed by them. They can provide support in strengthening their governance structures, technical capacities and so on, but they can also support them by strengthening their balance sheets, providing equity capital, hybrid capital, subordinate debt, and so on, guarantees of the whole toolkit. And I stop now because I'm on time. Thank you. I was the only one who was on time.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. So we've heard from civil society and academia about what can and has been done to address the contextual lived realities we heard about from our first two panelists. And now we'll turn to those in the either implementer role and experience of locally led and country-owned and driven development, as well as a perspective from an African think tank. And here we have three speakers. The first is Mrs. Ioma Ozulumba, who's Executive Director, the Development Bank of Nigeria, who will speak about the role of national development banks in this particular context. The second speaker will be Amal Lee Amin, who's a Managing Director and Head of Climate Diversity and Advisory at the British International Investment, who will speak on how bilateral DFIs can support locally led and community-driven development. And the third speaker will be John Asafu Ajayi, Senior Fellow at the African Center for Economic Transformation, who will be sharing a perspective from an African think tank. So I'd like to turn to Madame Ioma, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. From Development Bank of Nigeria, we are a local DFI, a public development bank established in Nigeria on the, with a consortium of development partners, largely the World Bank, the African Development Bank, EIB, and also AFD. But just as an example of a national development bank that has led, formed by international agencies, but really on the ground assisting development locally. We're a wholesale lender, so we provide wholesale finance to other banks in Nigeria. Over the past 7 years, we've been able to reach about 700,000 SMEs with access to finance. And we see a lot of work on the ground in Nigeria, but we also see how it affects the region. Of course, Nigeria being the most populous African country of about 200 million people, and a lot of systemic poverty as well, which we hope that our intervention is going to address. In terms of community-led development and thinking that with climate justice, we are currently implementing a project with the KfW. It's a 25 million euro credit line for renewable energy. And this has been able to provide small businesses that are in that sector with capital to produce energy that is independent of the national grid and, of course, address the perennial energy crisis that we have. So you can imagine that that has implications for manufacturing, but also for education and livelihoods in general and decent jobs. But a project that interests me a lot and that we see as being able to have a lot of multiplier effects is the one that we are doing with the World Bank. It's a $70 million line, and it's for agriculture. And the synergy that we find is that it's going to provide access to finance for in the livestock value chain. And why that is of interest is in terms of climate change and desertification. As the desert is encroaching, we find that the cattle headers moving south in search of pasture. And of course, over the years, that has led to clashes with the farmers. So we always in Nigeria talk about these farmer header clashes. But people don't realize that it's really a climate change problem. And so what this intervention is going to do is to provide access to finance for the smallholder farmers, but also using an aggregator model where they then are able to milk the cows and find an integrated solution for preserving the milk and for access to market. So immediately that addresses quite a number of the SDGs, and that's why we see it as a multiplier kind of project. Apparently, the predominant protein source for children will be the milk, but because milk is so unstable, it has to be immediately processed to yogurt to give it more shelf life. And so that helps to address, of course, the hunger, the education for the children as also. The smallholder farmers also find a way to ensure that they have an offtake for their milk. And of course, that addresses decent jobs and livelihood as well. In terms of the Development Bank of Nigeria, in the future, looking forward on climate, we've also been recently accredited by the GCF, the Global Climate Fund, the Green Climate Fund, and we intend to use that accreditation to deliver even more projects within Nigeria. A critical part of our work is also in technical assistance and capacity building. And for instance, for the livestock line, we're looking at training all the stakeholders. Sandra, you talked about ensuring that we build a local ecosystem. And this is one of the parameters in designing the project, that this looks at the women as well. Because we find that in that community, the women do the bulk of the work, but they are also excluded in terms of financially, and also giving them training on how to more milking techniques and how that can be impacted in a positive way. So it's going to be also training the banks that we work with on how to lend to this sector. So it's community-led and also climate justice in this particular project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Yoma. Amal Lee, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. So just to say, I'm Amelia Min. The BII stands for British International Investment. So we're the UK's DFI, so a PDB, but we only work with the private sector and through the private sector. So a lot of what we are doing, I mean, in terms of our strategy, we have a climate strategy, which we have set out 3 goals to be supporting countries' transition to net zero, ensuring resilient development, and also we have placed just transition as one of the core pillars of our strategy. And so a lot of that is also how we, when we make our investments, we can bring technical assistance alongside to ensure that we are not only supporting the companies, but also we can provide training for local communities so that actually they can get jobs, good jobs within these companies. So that is like one of the key ways in which we're quite focused on the just transition. But I wanted to talk here briefly about a particular initiative that we've been leading. Actually was launched at Fix One, the first Fix here, well not here, in South Africa, in Paris, in 2020. It was actually a virtual event primarily for Adaptation and Resilience Investors Collaborative. And we've been, since then, working with other DFIs like ourselves, multilateral development banks, some other funds and impact investors, with UNEP-FI, who are the secretariat for ARIC, on ways in which we can really increase private finance and investment for adaptation as complementary to what governments are doing, and in fact what governments will really need to be able to harness the innovation and the ability to better manage some of these risks. But of course, a key question is how to ensure that these types of investments are really benefiting local communities, that we're really enabling resiliency for local communities, as well as particularly smallholder farmers. Actually, a lot of the types of solutions that we are seeing are actually quite focused on providing adaptation services to agriculture, in particular smallholder farming communities. So we actually had yesterday, it was a workshop here, very kindly hosted by South North, partnering also with International Institute for International Environment and Development, IID, UNEP-FI, where we brought together a number of organizations to really understand how can we better ensure that local voices are being effectively integrated into what we're doing as we look to increase private investment for adaptation. So I think just a very few takeaways from that I'm just going to feed back. So I think very, very consistent with what we've heard today, and also with the forest report that I was reading. So ensuring a more sort of decentralized decision-making where communities are really integrated into the planning of projects from the outset is going to be key. And recognizing also that in pretty much all countries, there will already be strong local community networks. So ensuring that they are engaged, not trying to recreate something new, not trying to replace them, but ensure that they feed in, harness their own networks to then feed in to develop the type of inclusive strategies that will be that are needed to ensure that more marginalized voices can be effectively incorporated. One of the good things that I think we probably are all seeing in some contexts is that the greater availability of open data and more digital access, whether mobile phone in particular, which can help financial inclusion, but also can also be very effective in helping to provide greater, ensure local voices are also better integrated as well. So I thought that was quite an interesting takeaway from the discussion. So, I mean, what we concluded, of course, that this really needs to be the beginning of continuing dialogue, continuing effort to ensure that as we continue to try to invest more on climate adaptation, that is done in a way that is really benefiting local communities first and foremost. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John?
Thank you, Alice. I'd like to start off by saying that Africa is facing a quadruple crisis of climate vulnerability, escalating debt, environmental degradation, and jobless growth. And this is because most African countries have failed to transform their economies. A lot of them are still relying on exports of raw primary commodities, and so the growth that we've seen in the past has not been sustained. It's commodity-led growth, and it has failed to create jobs. The job situation is very serious. We saw riots in Kenya, Nigeria, and the Sahel last year. The question I want to address in under 5 minutes is how can PDBs, especially international DFIs, support locally driven financial institutions for development? Let me start by saying DFIs, actually, international DFIs, currently support over 6 million African jobs in the private sector. But if you look at the fact that 24 million Africans, young Africans, are unemployed, obviously they can do a lot more. Most of the DFI investments are in financial services. This is between 41 to 61% of their investments. And so lending to local FIs, such as the National Development Bank of Nigeria and other FIs, can actually enable DFIs to reach more MSMEs, especially those in sectors such as renewable energy, agriculture, where there's great potential for job growth. But to have impact for job growth, it is important to ensure that a substantial part of the DFI investment should be directed to MSMEs. Now, the thing about the MSMEs is that most of them can actually grow jobs in the informal sector. Currently, the informal sector employs around 75% of graduates. It creates about 90% of new jobs in Africa. And many of these job creations can be done through MSMEs. But of course, there are concerns about the quality of informal jobs. We know that the sector earns less money. It's predominantly female, and it employs a lot of people living in extreme poverty. So what DFIs can do is to ensure that some of these needs actually goes to improve productivity in the informal sector. This would include upgrading jobs, upgrading skills, and also to help facilitate a move towards formalization of the sector. The MSC's major challenge is access to affordable finance. Currently, interest rates range from between 20 to 60%, which is very high, and in fact, a lot of them cannot even qualify for that because they don't have collateral. So DFI lending to the local FIs can target affordable loans for MSMEs. There are also other areas that I'd like to quickly highlight. One is the digital sector. Africa's digital sector is expected to reach 180 billion around by the end of this year, and it should grow to about 712 billion by 2050. This is about 8.5% of Africa's GDP. So DFIs can and should invest in this sector. Then the other issue which they can address is gender inequality in the workforce. One estimate has it that addressing gender equality in Africa's workforce can boost regional GDP to by about 10%. Right? So just getting more females into the workforce. So here, DFI investments can be targeted towards expanding female labor force participation. Of course, most of the females, especially those in the formal sector, do not lack skills, do not have the adequate skills, so they'll need to invest in skills upgrade. There's also the need to target green jobs, especially in agriculture and manufacturing. 45 out of 54 African countries have actually provided updated nationally determined contributions, so most of them want to reduce emissions, although African countries are among the most affected. How can they do this? Well, it's really by through green industrialization, green jobs, starting in agriculture and manufacturing. And I think this is an area where DFI lending is currently very low, and so there'll be a need for them to increase the amount of investment in these areas to create more green jobs. Thank you for the opportunity, and I think I'll rest here.
Thank you very much. You stopped on time without me standing up. We have 15 minutes to be extra. Thank you to the interpreters and the organizers because we started 15 minutes late. So we've got permission to carry on to 4:45. I'd like to open up now for any questions, comments, observations. Do we have a roving mic? Wonderful. It's at the back there. Any questions? Yes, there's a question over there. And if you can remember to whom you think you'd like to address it, that may be helpful.
Hello, everyone. Mine is more of a comment than a question. My name is Mao Emis. I'm from the African Center for Green Economy. We're a think tank that's based here in Cape Town. My question, or rather my comment, is around the importance of indigenous knowledge systems. You know, when we're talking about community-led adaptation or development, we cannot underestimate the importance of indigenous knowledge system, and I often find that it's lacking in this kind of spaces, and that in many cases leads to maladaptation. I'll give an example of food systems where development practitioners come to a local community and encourage community members to start growing crops that traditionally they don't grow in those areas. And what happens then is that those type of initiatives fail and leading into basically communities becoming despondent and so on. So my question, I suppose, to Amai Lee Amin, in terms of the discussions that you've had, how important do you think is IKS, and what steps are these kind of initiatives taking to ensure that indigenous knowledge systems are mainstreamed into local development initiatives? Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much for that question. Yes, over in the front here on the right. Thank you.
Oui, je vais.
Thank you. I'm going to speak in French. Just give you the time to put your headset. My name is Apollinaire. I'm coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo. My question goes to the last speakers. We were talking about DFIs. You were talking about financing communities so that there will be resilience. That's all I got. I want to, national national banks, countries that are considered as poor countries, and the financial policy excludes poor people because these investments are deemed dangerous and risky in these countries. So how do you collaborate? How do you address them so that they can review the financial policies so that they won't exclude these vulnerable people? That's my concern. My second one, don't you think that we are overlapping public policies because local communities they are based on sustainable development goals, and yet the private sector is based on neoliberalism. How can you reconcile these interests in terms of climate change and whose effects are seen in our communities, in our countries? Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur. I think at this stage, let's have some of the first questions answered. If I could turn, first of all, to, because I understood the questions were for the last few speakers. You didn't specify. There were last three speakers. I assume, sir, you wanted all three of them to answer the questions, the two questions you've asked? Okay. Madame Ioma, could we start with you in relation to the questions which were asked about financing for resilience? How are the poor actually included? And the second one was looking at the neoliberal paradigm and how we make sense of it in terms of the consequences of that development model and the role of national development banks. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. So the role of a public development bank, especially a national one, it's really to catalyze additional funding for development. But like one of the questions also alluded, to properly situate it in such a way that you do not then create more problems instead of solving. So for instance, at DBN, we always look at all our lending from the paradigm of the law of unintended consequences. So don't create further problems while you're trying to solve one. A case in point, like the example that I shared, yes, you want the poor farmers to have access to finance, but you also don't want to lead with the finance. You want to build capacity first in training, in how to use debt more efficiently. So you're not just throwing money at the problem, but you're able to situate that money in a way that it does the good that you expect it to do. Also working with our partners on the ground, the banks understand the community, the environment. They've been able to be successful in lending in those areas. And so working with those partnerships also helps. How do we ensure that it reaches the poor? Through our microfinance lending. So a lot of the businesses, especially the ones run by women, are usually actually nano businesses, even rather than micro. So how do you begin to train them in how to use debt efficiently, how to have access to market, how to look at their business as a business rather than just as a means of sustaining the families from day to day. So a lot of capacity building needs to go in there. So it's not just the funding, but it's the system that you create around that particular intervention. The other part of the question, if I could just quickly speak to that. So yes, the large international financial institutions providing capital, and we need to use that a bit more judiciously. And how we reconcile the two paradigms is that we also create local funding. So what we've been able to do at Development Bank of Nigeria, on the back of all the funding that we received, we've also been able to float and issue a local bond, which we saw that the majority of the investors in that bonds was the pension funds, the asset managers locally. So you also have local capital. So as much as you are looking to the international capital markets, you are also mobilizing local funding at scale to address Africa's development problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I trust your questions have been answered, sir. Amal and John, the other questions were for you. How important are indigenous knowledge systems in your programming? And then the same too, relating to financing for resilience, how are the poor included, not just as beneficiaries, but included in the planning, etc., throughout the process? And the third is the reconciling of the two paradigms, bearing in mind the dominance of the neoliberal paradigm. I'll start off with John and then Amal.
So let me pick up the whole issue of indigenous knowledge systems. I think this is very important, especially when it comes to adaptation, even some aspects of mitigation as well. And I would say that they've been largely overlooked. But I think going forward, it is very important to mainstream it into local systems. And I'm one of the people who believe that it's a very good source of information which can actually which can lead to effective climate action. So I am all for it, but I think there's the need to create more awareness, and so there needs to be more exchanges or interactions or dialogue, between DFIs, public-private sector, and also this large group of indigenous knowledge systems that we can work with. So I think that's what I'll say. Let me pass it on to Amal.
Thank you. I mean, very similar to the points made from by the colleague from the Nigerian Development Bank, that, it's really about ensuring we build capacity of those local actors. So we work through, because as a DFI we don't provide financing at a very local level, but we do work with intermediaries to provide technical assistance to work with microfinance institutions who are very close to the communities. So, and building their capacity to ensure they're effectively engaging and bringing the local solutions in. We certainly wouldn't want to be where we can, and I know actually in a previous role, there's a good example in Guatemala of reintroducing indigenous chickens actually in the Dry Valley, was actually a key part of an adaptation strategy. So again, I think it goes back to the point that we have to ensure that we harness and leverage the community networks, and microfinance institutions being a key part of integrating their knowledge upwards to the financial institutions is key, and that's where we bring this technical assistance capacity building to enable that, and then ensuring more sort of continuous learning, public-private dialogues, ensuring we can create learning at a national level, bringing communities across at a national level, but also at a regional level as well.
Thank you. I notice the neoliberal paradigm has not been addressed, but it may pop up again later. Were there other questions? Yes, over here, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Tando here, Climate Action Network, South Africa. I've got two questions and a comment. I'll be very succinct, but also just to say my questions aren't specifically targeted at any individual speaker. So if you feel you can respond to it, please do. Question one is around the local resource base. One of the questions I have is, how can we mitigate against risk, specifically governance related? To give you a specific example, South Africa a few years ago had the renewable energy auctions. As part of the auctions, they set up community trusts. The community trusts were intended to address the very local needs of communities where the plants are being set up. Those trusts exist in name, but some of those resources have not trickled towards the development that I think we're talking about today. This was something from like 2014, 15, if not just a touch before that. So how can we mitigate against that risk, number one? Number two, how can we leverage against existing financial flows? Now, specifically climate finance, right? So let's make an example. AFDB says that they're looking for bankable ideas on the continent. Now, the idea behind bankable is that you have to be able to leverage some kind of debt in order to make it worthwhile. But some of the scale that we're talking about is too small for, let's call it, commercial entities to be able to really invest in, right? We're talking about small scale farming in some instances. We're talking about maybe like communal farmlands in other areas. So how can we respond to that particular issue? Related to that is, and again in terms of financial flows, is the kind of lesser liked topic, and that is Article 6/carbon markets, right? They have been very specific in terms of driving financial flows to places like Africa. So how can we leverage those already existing channels to be able to meet the needs that we're currently discussing here? And then the last one just speaks to a general comment again, and that speaks to this idea of net zero. Now, literature says that Africa is, 3% responsible for GHG emissions globally. So that puts us arguably closest to net zero amongst all other 7 continents, right? So is there a way in which, recognizing now what I believe to be a competitive and comparative advantage that the continent has over other regions, is there a way that that could be used as one of those kind of linchpins to support financial flows or increase in financial flows into the continent? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Francina Nkosi from Lepalale, the host of Medupi Power Station under the organization called Waterberg Women Advocacy Organization. My question and also input is to the three last speakers. For the speakers who spoke before, they talked about the bottom-up approach. Now, for me to ask the last three speakers is, in order to follow the bottom-up approach, is that possible to also look at going to communities and looking at how to do the bottom-up approach in making sure that there is gender inclusivity in that, and also doing the free, prior, and informed consent in making sure that if there is a project that needs to be done in communities, it's upliftment and of the marginalized that are in the community, rather than somebody saying, you do this, but as a community, requesting that in their own local language, not in the language that they don't understand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll start with the last question because it was specifically directed to all three of the panelists. And I'll start with Madame Ioma and then go to Amali and then to John. And the previous speaker had asked questions which you may or may not feel free to answer. Madame Ioma?
Thank you very much. I think it still goes towards situating the project locally within the community. For instance, from a Development Bank of Nigeria perspective, last year, we also found this problem, and we specifically now conduct training in the local languages, especially in the northern part of the country. And this was quite useful, especially for the poor farmers and also the women. So how do they scale their business? How do they become more involved? But we found partners that could provide those trainings in their local languages, and we found that the feedback was quite significant. And also through our partners, we found that they then are able to save more in the formal banking system, and they are able to also form themselves into associations and cooperatives. And those also, because of the way that it's been explained to them, they understand it more and they're able to, so there's more positive outcome when it's properly situated in the local community. I don't know if you want me to take the question on governance risk as well. Okay. Okay, if I understand the question, it's really about creating strong institutions in Africa, and that's one of the things that we've always alluded to in terms of development finance. So it's not throwing money at the problem, but it's what kind of institutions and what kind of policies do you create to kind of proof the organization. For instance, for Development Bank of Nigeria, it was a deliberate setup to say that it's going to be a public organization, but it's going to be private sector led. So on the board, it's a majority of independent directors who have to be competitively sourced by an international consulting firm. And the government, in the loan covenants that we have with the international banks, it's clear that interference of government or anything not done according to the laid down rules will be an occasion of default and that those loans could be called. So it's to bear down on the governance and ensure that the institutions that you build are subject to rules, code of corporate governance. And this is not just checking boxes, but actually ensuring implementation and that that's properly documented and monitored. So monitoring, also very important. Yesterday we talked about impact evaluation and assessment. So on the back of what you've done, what's the impact? How is that communicated? And then how does that cascade additional funding as well and impact? Thank you.
Mike, thank you. My mic's back on. We're moving now towards the wrapping up stage. So I'd like to go back to Madame Ioma, because I'm going to be asking every speaker, so those who are still going to answer questions after you've finished your answer, if you could give us one specific takeaway and one action in half a minute. We're a very ambitious group of people. Madame Ioma, if you have one takeaway, specific, and one action, please.
Okay, I'll link it to one of the last questions we talked about. How do we then continue to leverage financial flows? I think it's through partnerships and especially I think a lot of discussion right now on how aid is going to slow down or even stop, especially to developing economies. But then how do we use partnerships to continue to ensure that developing economies thrive and also be able to help themselves? So the connection between, yes, using international funds, but also developing local capacity and harnessing local, especially private funding to multiply development impact. So partnerships and private funding. Thank you.
To John, the question was about bottom-up approach.
Right. So what I will briefly say there is that there's the need to work more closely with local communities, especially in the informal sector. And the idea really is to build their capacity. And then maybe quickly on the question on Article 6, in terms of raising more climate finance, I think here there's really a good opportunity. Africa currently contributes to less than 4% of global carbon markets. So we can up our game, but there are lots of issues we have to address. The governance issue needs to be addressed. Institutions need to be addressed. And one big issue that needs to be addressed is really the whole issue of land tenure. Because a lot of the land in Africa do not have title. And we need to do that in order to attract investment. So back to you.
Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you. So, yeah, I think just on the points about how we can ensure that we continue to engage. I mean, I think as highlighted, we do see the role of technical assistance is critical because it means we can strengthen engagement at the local, between the local actors, particularly, as I say, MFIs, which is a big priority. I mean, for us at BI, I mean, I've talked a bit about climate, but we are we're one of the founding members of the 2X collaborative, to increase more of our finance investments as well as from private sector into women women-owned businesses, women, well, the 2X criteria, I won't talk through that in the time available, but, and that is a really big priority. So, and we try to ensure for every investment we look at it to see is it already qualifying with 2X, but if not, then we can also work with the company to increase the workforce, to increase the services, ensure, particularly for some of the bigger companies, that they put in place effective policies around, maternity leave, childcare, et cetera, So these are really big, very big priorities for us. I think also I'll touch quickly on the carbon markets, because we've started to pilot an approach over the last year or so around the use of carbon markets, or being able to attract carbon markets within our investments. We take a very strong focus, or look very closely at the social and economic development benefits. We prioritize the development impact, and in particular, as ensure that local communities are fully aware, because we've seen some examples of cases where carbon markets are not, local communities are not being effectively consulted. So that's a very strong part of our due diligence, because we see that's potentially a lot of opportunities in Africa in particular, but also potentially some quite a lot of risks if not done well. So in terms of, what was it? Okay.
Takeaway in action.
Yeah, I mean, one takeaway, I think, the power, the sort of partnerships, how we're learning from each other, and ensuring that, we really do focus on being inclusive in all aspects of that. One action, well, I will continue to, which I've been doing for 2-3 years, focusing on the need for inclusive climate development finance, because I think that is a really important way of ensuring that we are remain very, very focused on the most vulnerable, the poorest, and ensuring those voices are fully heard.
Thank you very much. Could I turn to the rest of the panelists? Ulrich, one takeaway, one action in half a minute.
Yeah, thank you. You're very critical of me. So the insight is the mobilization of international private capital hasn't been particularly successful, and we are also doomed if we trust in the mobilization of more public international capital. So action, let's use the power of MDBs, of international development finance institutions, to really strengthen, empower local financial institutions through capacity building, but also through financial means, work through them and mobilize more domestic capital to really get things going. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sandra?
Thank you. I think the one takeaway really from today is that we have a dialogue across the board, from communities to civil society to DFIs and national development banks. We are sitting at one table and talking. I think that's really inspiring. And going forward to action, I hope that we can agree and probably use the fixed space as a continuation of a more regular and systematic dialogue between PDBs and civil society and I think this is a great inspiration of what so good stuff is already happening, and co-designing further a good model for us, how we work together as with civil society, with the communities, really making sure that what the PDBs are doing is really is for the people and for the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Robbie?
One takeaway for me would be there's still a need to have continuous dialogue, not only with DFIs, but also with the private sector and the academe, in relation to really understanding when we say people-led solutions, because supporting people-led solutions is beyond engaging, it's beyond hearing the voices of the people, but making sure that there's recognition of the agency of the people to be able to lead the development that they want, that they are part of the decision-making, and this is where the free, prior, and informed consent process ease that was mentioned a while ago. And part of the people-led solution that we're talking about is also ensuring that interventions are not one-off. For example, in the work on Indigenous peoples-led renewable energy, 90% of our work is community organizing and community strengthening. 10% of that is a technology. You really need to build the capacity, the governance, decision-making, negotiation powers of the community to be able to strike that balance of advancing their own development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christelle?
From us is this coalition between PDBs and civil society organization, which for us is very critical, and it can be a very good platform to co-create solutions, sustainable solutions, but also transformative solutions. So I will invite you to go ahead and look at the findings of the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joseph.
Thank you so much. Let me quickly comment. There was a question on the indigenous knowledge. I really want to plead that we should really take it seriously. Imagine we want to implement a project, but we don't want to involve people. And those people, they really have the knowledge of where they reside. We have traditional leaders, we have elderly from the community who can help us in co-designing the solution. And my last point is to really ask that climate adaptation, let them go beyond resilience. There should be an opportunity, as my colleague from the Development Bank of Nigeria said, where we can see more jobs created, more involvement of women. Let's help with the local enterprise and strengthen the economy system. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Madame Famo?
Thank you very much. We would like to conclude by saying that we should try to value indigenous knowledge by involving communities, but we need also to support them with the initiatives that they are launching themselves. We also need to go through a just energy transition, and for that, we shouldn't strengthen the inequalities that are already existing by favoring big corporations over local needs. We need to redirect the financing of development towards decentralized mechanisms that strengthen local economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As we draw to a close, some of the points which I heard and which struck me included the role of affected communities should be taken into account, that decentralized decision-making is very important, that development by communities and not development for communities, that there needs to be an increase in green jobs, that indigenous peoples are able to lead using indigenous knowledge and modern technology for ensuring a holistic approach to strengthen defense of land rights and resources, that it's important to understand who defines development, that it's important that international financial support is only a complement to local resource mobilization and does not replace it. I'd like to thank you all very much and to say that at the center of this, our collective journey, our lives, our lived experiences, at the center of all that lies dignity. Today we have shared and learned about lives lived without dignity, about what can be done to ensure that lives are lived with dignity, and how development banks and financial institutions can play a critical role in enabling communities, the people, to live in and with dignity. So does it take transformation or bold and radical rethinking, reconceptualizing of development and the development paradigm, as well as action? to literally shift the balance for good development, for the good of people, for the good of our shared planet, and for good business sense. Once again, I'd like to thank you for joining us. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you too to the interpreters for giving us the extra 15 minutes. It's been truly an honor to be part of this vibrant gathering at FIX, where our shared commitment to sustainable and inclusive development lights up our onward path to meaningful and effective action for the sustainable rootedness of the dignity of all. Thank you very, very much.